The funeral home's air hung thick as wet wool, smelling of dust and forgotten lilies. My fingers traced the seawater-stained lace, stiff as dead seaweed, pressed against my palm. I documented it meticulously, brine crystallizing at the edges, the way the fabric clung to my skin like a second layer of cold. The brine tasted of drowned pearls, metallic and sharp, as I rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger. I didn't notice the lace's origins. I never did. My notebook lay open, ink smudging where my damp thumb had touched it. A distorted melody seeped from the basement wall, a childhood music box tune warped, as if played through wet glass. A lullaby for the drowned-eyed I'd called it in my head, though I'd never heard it since I was 7. The melody twisted, the notes stretching like taffy in the cold air. I turned back to the coffin, the lace still clutched in my hand. The funeral home's Victorian grandeur felt hollow, the gilded mirrors reflecting nothing but the dim, failing light. Rain drizzled against the window panes, not falling but footing-coating. The glass like frozen tears. I reached for the lace again, the brine stinging my palm where it had scraped against the rough edges. The melody deepened, the music box's discordant tune now echoing from the wall itself, the sound vibrating through the floorboards beneath my boots. Then I heard the forte crack. Not a snap, but the slow, wet unraveling of fabric under strain. The lace in my hand tensed, then tore. I looked down. The wedding dress lace, the one I'd pulled from the coffin lid, was already gone from the coffin, ripped away by something moving in the shadows. My breath hitched. The cat emerged from the coffin's shadowed corner, its mossy fur matted with damp soil, bioluminescent fungi pulsing beneath its damp coat like drowned fireflies. Its fur glistened with the same glassy sheen as the rain on the window. The cat moved with unnerving silence, its mossy head lowering toward the coffin. The lace it held was now torn free, the fabric darkened by seawater, insects crawling from the seams. The cat's mouth opened, and the insects leapt, tiny, frantic things, into its damp maw. I saw the way the bioluminescent fungi flared brighter where the insects landed, the light casting jagged shadows on the coffin's lid. The cat's mossy fur emitted a faint, almost imperceptible foot crackle, the sound of insects dissolving into the damp moss. The music box melody reached a fever pitch, the notes warping into a single, high, strained tone. The cat lifted its head, the insect still moving within its mouth, the moss on its fur glistening with the bioluminescent light. I watched, my notebook forgotten on the coffin's edge, the lace in my hand now just a damp, useless scrap. The cat's moss flared, a sudden, sharp crackle, as the last insects leapt into its mouth, and the melody from the wall stopped. The funeral home went utterly, terrifyingly silent. The bioluminescent fungi faded to a dull, wet glow, the cat's moss emitting a final faint sizzle as the insects vanished into its damp fur. The projector hummed to life, its ancient gears grinding like distant thunder as I threaded the VHS tape through its teeth. The machine was a relic from another time, its dusty casing a testament to years of neglect. It stood in the corner of this forgotten funeral home parlor, a silent witness to the decay around it. I pressed play, and the screen flickered into existence with a burst of static, like snowflakes exploding against the cold glass. The tape hissed as it began its journey back through time, the sound mingling with the relentless tiv and drip of rain on the tin roof above. Each droplet fell in syncopation with the music box's offbeat clunk from the basement wall, a discordant symphony echoing through the hollow house. The projector whirred steadily as it devoured the tape, its beam casting an eerie glow onto my face, reflected back at me like a ghostly doppelganger. I watched myself age in reverse on the screen, from the weathered man of 30 to the young boy of 7, but there was no joy in this journey through time. It felt more like watching someone else's life unfold, distant and disconnected. Then it happened. My breath hitched as a photograph flickered onto the screen, a childhood image of me standing beside my mother at her graveside on a wet day much like today. The rain in that memory was no different from this one, coating everything with its glassy sheen, but I hadn't felt its cold touch since that day long ago. A chill ran down my spine, as if the very air had turned to ice around me. My name stared back at me from the tape's spine in fading ink, Samuel Dubois. The cat, hidden somewhere among the shadows cast by the projector's beam, seemed to echo this intrusion with a low twine mew, like an ancient language whispered through wet moss. The wooden puppet on its shelf across the room began to mimic my movements, its head tilting slightly as mine did. But I refused to look at it directly. Instead, I kept my gaze fixed on the screen, watching myself age backwards in fast-forward motion. The cat's soft tufa grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to drown out the music box's offbeat clunk and the projector's steady whir. I noticed then that the rain had stopped its relentless tattoo against the tin roof, A sudden silence that seemed almost unnatural after hours of ceaseless drip-drip. The cat's purring intensified, filling this void with a low, rhythmic hum. Then, without warning, it ceased abruptly, just as the puppet's head tilted another fraction further. 15 degrees past its natural limit, the wooden creature stared at me now, its painted eyes seeming to glow in the dim light cast by the projector behind us both. I felt betrayed, not just by this once familiar place, but also by my own reflection staring back at me from the screen, a stranger's face frozen in time. The cat emerged from the shadows then, its damp, mossy fur glowing with an otherworldly blue-green light, the bioluminescent fungi casting jagged shadows on the walls around us. It moved closer to the puppet, its head lowering towards it as if listening for something only they could hear. The music box's melody reached a fever pitch again. A warped childhood tune played through wet glass, and I realized with growing dread that this was no longer just an old funeral home filled with forgotten memories. This place had become something else entirely, something ancient and alive, feeding on the decay of time itself. And it wanted me to stay here forever, trapped in its endless cycle of memory and betrayal. The stone was slick, resisting my brush. Not with water exactly, but a film, a greasy patina of something that wasn't quite mold, nor quite lichen. More like a slow blooming. I knelt, the damp seeping through my trousers, and worked at the tombstone, the bristles catching on the uneven surface. The music box downstairs had begun to fray, the melody stuttering, each note a chipped porcelain doll. It sounded like wet parchment tearing, a delicate, brittle ripping that resonated deep within my chest. The cat, a shifting mound of damp earth and emerald luminescence, was nearby. It wasn't twitwatching me, not in the way a cat usually does. It was attending, its attention focused entirely on the stone, its head lowered, as if listening for a conversation happening just beneath the granite's surface. I could feel the subtle vibration of its purr, a low thrumming against the floorboards. I continued to scrub, the stone slowly yielding. Initials began to emerge, carved deep into the stone. A delicate, looping script. A CB. Then, beneath it, a smaller, more hesitant. I paused, my fingers tracing the newly revealed letters. The music box stuttered again, a particularly violent tear in the melody, and the cat's body shifted. Not a movement, exactly, but a subtle rearrangement of its mossy coat. The damp soil seemed to breathe to rearrange itself around the stone's base. My fingers brushed against the ease. It felt cold, sharper than the surrounding stone. I pressed harder, clearing away the last of the clinging growth. The cat's purr intensified, becoming almost a growl, and then I saw it. The full initial, a graceful cursives followed by the rest. AMUELDOI. I said, my name carved into the tombstone of someone who shared my name, someone who had died long ago. A prickling sensation spread across my skin. It wasn't cold, not exactly. More like 1,000 tiny insects crawling beneath the surface. I glanced at the cat. It hadn't moved, but the moss covering its body was changing, not growing, but twitching, small fragments of the damp, green substance separated from its fur, drifting down onto the stone. They weren't falling, though. They were replicating. Each tiny piece, as it touched the granite, expanded, mimicking the texture, the shape. The music box was nearly broken now, the melody a series of disjointed fragments. A child's tune, warped and distorted, playing through a broken speaker. I stared at the cat and then at the stone. The moss fragments, now larger, were forming a perfect three-dimensional replica of my fingertip. A perfect miniature version, lying on the stone, glistening with moisture. The texture was unsettlingly accurate. The lines, the ridges, even the faint discoloration from a long Ego paper cut. I snatched my hand away, a wave of nausea washing over me. The cat's gaze locked with mine, not a gaze of curiosity or even of predatory intent. It was knowing. A deep, ancient knowing. And then, the replica of my fingertip, the mossy construct Femov D. It twitched, flexing at the base, as if testing its newly formed joints. A perfect, silent echo of my own hand. The cat led me down into the sub-basement, its damp moss glowing like a bioluminescent trail in the gloom. The music box upstairs had begun to play something new, a child's lullaby, tinny and out of tune, each note shattering against the walls before dissolving into silence. I could feel it vibrating through the soles of my boots, resonating deep within my chest. The sub-basement was a labyrinth of rotting shelves and forgotten coffins, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something sweet, almost cloying. The cat's glow-illuminated mushrooms growing in profusion along the walls, their caps glistening like wet opals. They seemed to pulse gently, casting an eerie blue-green light over everything. I followed the cat deeper into the maze, my breath misting in the freezing air. Each step echoed loudly, a metallic rasp against the cold concrete floor. The lullaby upstairs had begun to distort, the melody twisting and warping until it sounded like a child's scream echoing through a broken speaker. The cat stopped suddenly at the base of an old stone wall. Its head tilted back, its gaze fixed on something high up among the cobwebs. I followed its line of sight but saw nothing except more damp moss and decay. Then I heard a faint scratching sound like fingernails against stone. It echoed through the chamber, resonating in my bones. The cat's glow intensified as it began to climb the wall, its claws clicking against the ancient stones. As it ascended, the mushrooms along the walls seemed to respond, their pulses quickening and intensifying until the entire sub-basement was bathed in an otherworldly light. I watched, transfixed, as the cat reached a small ledge halfway up the wall. It turned back to look at me, its eyes glowing like twin lanterns against the mossy darkness of its face. Then it began to speak, a low rhythmic chanting that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The lullaby upstairs had degenerated into a series of discordant shrieks, each one scraping against my eardrums like nails on slate. I clapped my hands over my ears but could still feel the vibrations resonating through my skull. The cat's chanting grew louder, drowning out even the music box's cacophony. I stared at the ledge where the cat had been standing mere moments ago. It was empty now except for a small wooden puppet, its paint chipped and faded by time and dampness. As I watched, it began to move, its head twisting slowly 90 degrees until it seemed to stare directly into my soul. The music box upstairs suddenly fell silent, the last shrieking note lingering like a dying breath in the cold air. The cat's chanting stopped abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to press against me from all sides. Then I felt something touch my skin, a soft, damp pressure on my forearm. Looking down, I saw with horror that the puppet's right hand had detached and was now lying there, its wooden fingers twitching as if reaching for something just out of reach. I stared at it in disbelief, my heart pounding wildly against my ribs like a trapped animal. The music box began to play again upstairs, a single note repeating over and over, each one driving another spike into the frozen silence that had taken hold of me. The cat looked down from its position high on the wall, its eyes glowing eerily in the pulsating light of the mushrooms below. It opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth stained green with damp moss, and it spoke again, a single word whispered softly but clearly against the staccato rhythm of the music box. "Mine," it said, and everything went dark. The radio was a theft, naturally. From the funeral home's office, a squat, black Bakelite thing smelling of dust and regret. It felt cold in my hands, heavier than it looked, the dial stiff and reluctant to turn. I'd positioned it on a stack of warped coffin lids, the concrete floor slick beneath my boots with a constant drip of condensation. The puppet, propped against a chipped urn, seemed to watch my every move, its painted eyes following the arc of my hand as I adjusted the tuning knob. Outside, the rain hadn't lessened. It wasn't a downpour, not exactly, but a relentless needling drizzle that coated everything. The shelves, the coffins, the moss, covered cat in a film of shimmering water. The sound wasn't the forceful drumming I'd expected, but a muted, insistent hiss like static bleeding from a damaged speaker. It clung to the stone walls, amplified by the sub-basement's cramped dimensions. I rotated the dial slowly, searching for a signal, anything to break the oppressive quiet. The music box upstairs, or what remained of it, had fallen silent after the cat's pronouncement. Just silence. A silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. The puppet's stillness felt less like inactivity and more like observation. I needed noise. Needed something to fill the void. A crackle, then a hiss, growing stronger. Not a clear signal, not yet, but a promise of one. The air tasted of ozone and something else, something acrid and metallic, like old pennies. I nudged the dial again, and the static coalesced, resolving into a distorted melody, fractured and broken. It was the lullaby. The same tinny, out-of-tune but warped, stretched, as if played through a broken phonograph. It resonated with a hollow ache in my chest, a phantom echo of childhood. The cat perched on the highest shelf began to shift, not a deliberate movement but a subtle unraveling. The moss, normally a vibrant, almost luminous green, seemed to dissolve, not into nothingness, but into a fine grey dust that drifted down, revealing patches of matted fur beneath, and then I saw them, insects. Not swarming, not yet, but emerging from beneath the moss, crawling over the cat's skin, disappearing into the fur. They were small, black, and moved with a disturbing, purposeful rhythm. They weren't biting, not yet, but burrowing. The cat didn't react, didn't flinch. It simply continued to watch me, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling calm. I tried to look away to focus on the radio, but the static had intensified, becoming a roaring white noise that drowned out everything else. The melody was almost completely submerged, reduced to a series of discordant shrieks. It was as if the radio was actively resisting my attempts to tune it, fighting me with waves of interference. Then, one of the insects broke away from the mass, launching itself towards me. I swatted at it, missed, and felt a prickling sensation on my forearm. They weren't biting, but 20 entering, crawling into my pores, disappearing beneath my skin. A wave of nausea washed over me. I clawed at my arm, desperate to brush them off, but it was useless. They were too small, too numerous. The radio static surged, filling my head, and the lullaby was gone, replaced by a high-pitched whine that resonated deep within my skull. I looked down, at my arm, at the tiny black shapes moving beneath my skin. The sensation wasn't painful, not yet. It was invasive. A cold, creeping sensation that spread outwards from the point of entry. The cat's head tilted. Its moss continued to flake away, revealing more of its dark, soil-stained fur. The insects were moving faster now, a living tide of black against its skin. Then I felt it, a pressure in my ear canal. A tickling, crawling sensation. I instinctively reached up, my fingers brushing against something. Something moving, a black shape wriggling, forcing its way inside. A sizzling, not a loud crackle, but a quiet, insidious fizzing, like static electricity. And then, darkness, not the absence of light, but a distortion of it. A searing, burning sensation inside my ear. The radio static became the only reality. A searing, white-hot roar. My own scream was lost, swallowed by the hiss. The insects sizzled. The radio was a mockery. A black, bakelite grin in the gloom. I gripped it, the cold metal biting into my palm, and brought my heel down. Once, twice. The glass shattered with a brittle crystalline shriek, a sound that momentarily eclipsed the hiss of the rain and the drip, drip, drip from the ceiling. Fragments flew, glinting like malicious teeth in the dim light. The lullaby, that warped, fractured thing, abruptly ceased. The silence that followed wasn't a relief. It was a vacuum, a void that pressed against my eardrums, amplified by the ringing in my ears. The music box upstairs, what remained of it, remained stubbornly silent, a cruel joke. I felt a tremor in my hands, a residual vibration from the impact. The puppet propped against the urn didn't flinch. Its painted eyes remained fixed on me, an unsettling tableau of painted indifference. The cat, on its perch, shifted again. A slow, deliberate movement, like a machine winding down. The moss, that unnatural green, seemed to pulse faintly in the gloom, a sickly luminescence that made my stomach churn. The insects, those black, purposeful things, were still there, a writhing mass beneath the fur. They didn't cease their burrowing. I needed to stop it. This thing, this noise, this sifty presency. I needed to destroy it. I moved toward the remains of the radio, careful to avoid the scattered shards of glass. Each step echoed in the cramped space, a hollow percussion against the concrete floor. The air tasted of ozone, of something sharp and acrid. I bent down, ignoring the protesting ache in my back, and began to gather the fragments, the edges biting into my fingertips. Then, a new sound, a discordant clash, like two melodies struggling for dominance. The music box upstairs, it was playing. But it wasn't the same tune. It was another lullaby, a different variation, equally fractured, equally disturbing. The two melodies warred, creating a cacophony that resonated deep within my skull. It felt like my brain was splitting, tearing apart at the seams. The puppet's right hand moved. Not a jerky puppet-like movement, but a slow, deliberate extension. It reached for my forearm, its wooden fingers curling around my skin. I recoiled, a gasp escaping my lips. It felt cold, like ice. And then, a pressure, a tightening. A sensation of wood grain pressing into my flesh. I tried to pull away, but the grip was surprisingly strong. The cat let out a low hiss, a sound that vibrated through the stone walls. The insects, emboldened, began to crawl out from beneath the fur, forming a living tide that flowed towards me. I swatted at them, a frantic, useless gesture. More appeared, emerging from the moss, from the cracks in the concrete, from the very air itself. I had to break free. I tugged at my arm, desperate to release myself from the puppet's grasp. The wood grain deepened, becoming more pronounced, more real. I could feel it pressing against my bone, a slow, insidious encroachment. The two lullabies reached a fever pitch, a swirling vortex of discordant sound that threatened to overwhelm me. I lunged forward, throwing myself against the wall, the impact jarring the puppet's grip. but it held fast. The wood grain continued to spread, creeping up my arm, a slow, inexorable transformation. The metallic taste returned, stronger this time, coating my tongue. I could feel the insects crawling on my skin, burrowing beneath my pores, a living, crawling tide. The cat emitted another hiss, a sound laced with a strange, almost mournful quality. Its moss continued to flake away, revealing more of its dark, soil-stained fur. It watched me, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling knowing. I felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying sense of disorientation. The two lullabies merged, becoming a single, monstrous melody that resonated within my very bones. I braced myself, focusing all my strength on one final heave. With a grunt, I ripped my arm free, tearing the puppet's hand away. The grip released, but the transformation remained. The wood grain was still there, etched into my skin, a permanent reminder of the horror I had just experienced. It felt integrated. Part of me, and then I felt it again. That pressure in my ear, the crawling sensation. This time, it was more intense, more insistent. I instinctively reached up, my fingers brushing against something. Something fin-moving, a black shape, wriggling, forcing its way inside. The cat let out a final hiss, a sound that seemed to echo not from its throat, but from the very stone of the basement. The world tilted. The two lullabies dissolved into a single piercing shriek, and then darkness, not the absence of light, but a distortion of it. A searing, burning sensation that spread through my skull. The puppet's hand, now seamlessly integrated into my arm, began to migro. The wood grain deepened, spreading up my forearm, across my elbow, and finally, into my shoulder. It was no longer a mark, but a continuation, a grafting. The wood felt warm, alive, and it was sign-growing, pushing against my skin, threatening to engulf me. The rope burned my fingers as I coiled it around the puppet's wooden neck, the fibers biting into my palm like the teeth of some starving beast. The funeral home's air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and something older, something that slithered beneath the stone floors, patient and waiting. The music box upstairs had stilled, but its absence was worse than the dirge. It had resolved itself into a single, mournful note, a slow, dragging foin-creak-creak that echoed through the rafters like a coffin being lowered into a grave. My breath fogged in the cold, and for a moment I wondered if the cat was doing the same. It sat on the tombstone, its mossy hide shifting like the tide. The green wasn't just growing, it was breathing, expanding and contracting in time with something beneath the surface, a pulse, a mimicry. I swallowed hard. The metallic tang of the radios remained still clinging to my tongue. "You don't have to do this," I whispered, though I knew it was useless. The cat's ears twitched, not at my voice, but at the weight of the words themselves. The moss over its skull rippled differed, and I recoiled as it parted just enough to reveal the faintest trace of something beneath. Something that looked like Fodimai, not my face. Not exactly. My foot shape. The way my jaw set when I spoke, the way my eyebrows furrowed when I lied. The cat's tongue, black and forked, licked its lips, and the sound was wet, like parchment tearing in slow motion. I tied the knot tight. The rope groaned as I secured it to the tombstone's iron railing, the metal cold against my skin. The puppet's painted eyes followed my movements, unblinking, as if it could see through the layers of wood and paint and twenty-bone to the marrow of my intent. The music box's note deepened, warping into a dirge now, something slow and deliberate, like a funeral march conducted by hands that didn't belong to any human. The air thickened, pressing against my ribs, and I could feel the weight of it, the way it settled into my lungs, heavy as lead. The cat's moss sifted again. This time it wasn't just a ripple, it was a fifillation. The green peeled back like a second skin, and beneath it my face. Not a reflection, not a ghost. Tamvemi? The cat's entire head was now a grotesque mask of my features, the moss forming the contours of my nose, my lips, the hollows of my cheeks. Its eyes, still its own, glowed faintly like bioluminescent fungi pressed into the dark. It blinked, and the movement was swing mine, my eyelids fluttering in sync with its own. The dirge slowed. Each note dragged out, elongated into something agonizing like a wound being reopened. The puppet's hand twitched against the tombstone, its wooden fingers flexing as if testing the limits of its bonds. The cat's mouth opened, and the sound that came out wasn't a hiss. It was my voice. His Samuel. The name scraped against my skull, raw and unfamiliar, like teeth dragging across glass. The cat's tongue, my tongue, flickered out again, tasting the air. The moss over its body footer pulsed, syncing with the dirge's rhythm, and I realized with a sickening lurch that it wasn't mimicking me anymore. It was Sweetie leading. The puppet's hand moved, not a twitch, a frupur. The rope creaked as the wood strained against the stone, the fibers groaning under the pressure. The cat's head tilted, its semi-ears perked, and the dirge stopped at silence. Then, from the depths of the funeral home, something answered. A whisper, thin and reedy, but not human. It slithered up from the basement, from the cracks in the walls, from the spaces between my ribs. Finned Samuel. The cat's breath, my breath, hitched. And then the moss over its body. It melted. Not like water, like thinner memory. Like the way a photograph dissolves in acid, revealing nothing beneath but the dark. The green slid off in sheets, pooling on the tombstone like a slow, sickly rain. Beneath it, the cat's true face was revealed, not as itself, but as I feel nothing. A hollow, a void. And from that void, something emerged, a hand. Not the puppets, not the cats, some mean. But wrong too many fingers. Too long, the skin split open along the seams, revealing the black, writhing things beneath. The insects, the twirling spilling out in a living tide. The cat let out a sound that wasn't a scream, wasn't a purr, but something in between, something that vibrated through the stone and into my stew-teeth. And then it was swin gone. The rope snapped. The puppet's head whipped toward me, its painted smile stretching too wide, too knowing. The dirge resumed, but now it was sooty and seed me resonating in my skull. In my sooty bones, see the hand. My hand twisted, the fingers curling around the tombstone's edge, and the moss, what remained of it. Shifted one last time. It formed into my face. But not my face. A version of it, one that smiled. The wooden puppet's eyes blinked in unison with mine as I held it to the cat's mouth. The music box upstairs groaned one final note before disintegrating into a swarm of insects, their mandibles clicking like castanets against the wooden floorboards. Each chew echoed through the funeral home, a symphony of consumption that set my teeth on edge. The cat's breath was warm and damp as it washed over the puppet, its mossy hide pulsating with an otherworldly glow. The insects devoured the wood, their bodies writhing like maggots in moonlight. I could feel them through the puppet's handle, tiny legs scratching at my palm, seeking entry. The cat let out a low growl, not of hunger but recognition. Its moss-covered head tilted, eyes locked onto mine, or rather onto something behind me. The air grew colder still, and the metallic tang of the radio's remains clung to the back of my throat like a curse. I turned slowly, the puppet still clutched in my hand. The shadows seemed darker now, heavier somehow. They pressed against the walls like bodies crushed together on a subway car at rush hour, claustrophobic, suffocating. And yet, there was no noise save for the insect's ceaseless chewing and the distant drip of water somewhere unseen. The cat's growl deepened into a purr, vibrations resonating through its body and into mine via the puppet. Its voice echoed in my skull, drowning out all other sound. The dripping water, the clicking mandibles, even my own ragged breath. Samuel. My name was whispered on the wind, carried by unseen lips. The cat's ears twitched as it listened intently, its gaze never wavering from whatever held us captive behind those staring eyes. I felt a chill crawl up my spine at the realization that this wasn't just some discarded toy anymore. It had become something else entirely. Something Twimoroi. The puppet's painted mouth moved silently in time with mine as I whispered back, "Who are you?" "Samuel," came the reply, again softer now but no less insistent. The cat's purrs grew louder still, drowning out my heartbeat until all that remained was their rhythm. Its rhythm, and nothing else. The puppet's eyes blinked once more before focusing solely on me this time. They weren't just reflecting light anymore. They were reflecting something inside me. Some truth I'd long forgotten or perhaps never known at all. And then, everything went black. I lifted the cat, not gently, not with affection, but with a clinical detachment I hadn't known I possessed. Its weight surprised me, more substantial than it appeared, the damp moss and soil clinging to its fur like a second skin, cool and yielding under my hands. The puppet felt lighter by comparison, a brittle extension of my own arm. I hadn't consciously decided to do this. The decision simply so a cold calculation settling in my gut. A necessary subtraction. The air tasted of iron and something else, not blood, but the ghost of it, a metallic tang that coated the back of my tongue. Each breath felt labored, as if the very atmosphere had thickened, pressing in on my lungs. The insectile clicking had diminished, though not ceased. A subtle shift in the chorus, as if they anticipated something, or perhaps were simply concentrating on the diminishing space. Below, the floorboards groaned under my weight, a low, mournful sound that resonated through the silence. The funeral home held its breath. I could feel the puppet's wooden frame pressing into the cat's flank, a strange, uncomfortable intimacy. The cat didn't struggle. It didn't even flinch. Just a slow, deliberate blink, the mossy eyelids heavy and sluggish. Its gaze remained fixed on that point beyond me, a vacant stare that seemed to penetrate the walls, the floor, everything. The melody was gone. Not faded, not diminished, simply tied absentee. The music box upstairs had ceased its erratic fractured tune, leaving a void that felt more profound than any sound. The only auditory texture now was the rain, a relentless TV patter against the corrugated tin roof, a constant drumming rhythm that threatened to overwhelm everything else. Each drop was a tiny hammer blow, each gust of wind a whispered threat. I shifted my grip on the puppet, adjusting my hold, and felt a strange resonance. A tremor in the wood, a faint vibration that traveled up my arm. The puppet's eyes, those unsettlingly lifelike eyes, seemed to bore into mine. They weren't reflecting the dim light of the room anymore. They were reflecting something else, a hollowness, a vast emptiness that mirrored the growing void within me. A sense of recognition, of understanding, of terrible, inevitable surrender. The cat's purr, which had been a low rumble, intensified, vibrating through the puppet, through my hand into my bones. It wasn't a comforting sound. It was a resonance, a sympathetic vibration that amplified the emptiness within. It felt like a tuning fork resonating with a frequency I hadn't known existed. A frequency that was tearing me apart from the inside out. I tried to speak, to offer some meaningless reassurance to the creature I was about to. I couldn't form the words. My throat was constricted, my tongue leaden. All that escaped my lips was a ragged, shallow breath, a sound that felt alien, disconnected from my own body. The cat's head tilted slightly, its mossy fur brushing against the puppet's wooden face. And then, a voice not from the cat's mouth, but within my skull, a low, resonant whisper that bypassed my ears entirely. 14 Samuel. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a command, it was a statement of fact. An acknowledgement. A confirmation. It was as if the cat, or whatever inhabited it, had always known my name, had always known my purpose. The puppet's painted lips moved in silent synchronicity with the memory of the voice, a grotesque mimicry that sent a shiver down my spine. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself. I expected resistance, a struggle, some sign of protest, but there was nothing. The cat remained passive, accepting, resigned. It was as if it was 4D'd waiting for this, a willing participant in some dreadful, ancient ritual. The puppet's head, the carved wooden head, jerked violently, snapping away from the body with a sharp, sickening crack. The sound echoed through the room, momentarily drowning out the rain. The wood splintered, revealing not sawdust and hollows, but a tangled mess of wires and metal, a crude, makeshift antenna, gleaming with a dull, tarnished sheen, the source. The conduit, the radio's ghost, made manifest. And the cat, its mossy hide dissolving into static, its eyes fading into the same blackness. The puppet's antenna began to hum, a high, keening whine that resonated in my skull, drowning out the rain, the silence, everything. The insects ceased their clicking. Everything ceased, only the static. And the puppet, now a grotesque, metallic effigy, was looking directly at me. Not through me. Us. Me. The tin roof drummed a steady rhythm against my ears, each drop a tiny hammer strike on the corrugated metal. Not rain, not water, but something else. Liquid static pressing against the roof, seeping through the seams. The cat's mossy fur clung to the puppet's wooden frame, cool and damp like wet earth. I felt the puppet's weight shift, not in my hands but in my bones, as if it had grown roots into my marrow. The moss on the cat's fur began to glow faintly, a sickly bioluminescent green that pulsed in time with the drumming on the roof. Not light, but the absence of it, a void that swallowed the dim room. My hands turned to wood. I watched, detached, as the skin on my palms became grainy, the texture of weathered oak. Splinters pushed through my knuckles, not painful, just inevitable. The puppet's head tilted, its carved mouth forming a silent syllable. The drumming on the roof intensified, a steady, footy pitter-patter. That wasn't rhythm but a language. Fruity were always the sacrifice. The words weren't in the air, they were in the drumming, the way the tin roof is sung. The truth. The cat's purr faded, replaced by a high, keening hum that vibrated in my molars. The puppet's eyes, those unsettlingly lifelike eyes, reflected not my face but a distorted version. Me, but older, hollowed out. The moss on the cat dissolved into static, the green light fading to black. The puppet's wooden frame began to float, lifting from the floor without a sound. It moved toward the ceiling, a slow, deliberate drift, the carved lips forming words I'd never spoken aloud. The name echoed in my skull, not as a whisper but as a tuning fork struck against my own bones. I tried to move, to reach for the puppet, but my hands were wood, the splinters sharp and cold. The drumming on the roof rose, a relentless stiffer-pitter, patter that drowned out the silence. The cat's mossy eyes vanished, replaced by the puppet's reflection. My own face. But wrong, the hollows where my eyes should be. The puppet's head tilted, the carved mouth moving in perfect sync with the drumming. Samuel. The word wasn't coming from the puppet, it was Sandy Mabe saying it, my voice, but not mine. The drumming on the roof, the puppet's whisper, my own voice. All the same sound. The puppet hovered now, suspended between ceiling and floor, its wooden body radiating a faint, unnatural warmth. The drumming on the roof stopped. The silence was absolute, but the whisper remained. The puppet's painted lips moved, forming the word Fi Samuel without sound. The drumming on the roof had tiva come of the whisper. The rain had tiva come of the voice, and the voice was mine. The puppet floated, its wooden eyes fixed on me, and the whisper was tivan my voice. I had no breath left, no words, only the echo of the drumming that was my own name. The puppet's whisper was Samuel. The drumming was Samuel. The silence was Samuel, and the tin roof sang on.